2 American shipyards just signed on to build 14 nuclear-powered submarines under a single contract. 9 of them are fast attack boats. 5 of them will eventually carry the nation's sea-based nuclear deterrent. According to Navy procurement announcements, the deal is worth $76.6 billion, split between General Dynamics, Electric Boat, and Huntington Ingalls Industries. It covers 9 Virginia-class attack submarines and 5 Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines. On paper, it's a procurement contract. In practice, it's a decade of shipyard work, tens of thousands of jobs, and a bet on whether the United States can still build submarines fast enough to matter. So why does this contract exist now, and why does it matter that it locks in 22 Virginia-class boats as the Navy's target fleet size? That's the $76.6 billion question. What the money actually buys, how it splits between 2 very different classes of submarine, and why the Navy is willing to commit this much, this early, to shipyards that are already behind schedule. Let's start with what a contract like this actually does. This isn't the Navy buying 14 submarines off a shelf. It's locking in years of steel, labor, and components in advance, so 2 shipyards can plan their workforce and supply chains around a known volume of work instead of guessing year to year. According to the Navy's own procurement announcements, this specific award formalizes construction work that, in many cases, was already underway. Congress had already appropriated money for individual boats in prior budget cycles. What this contract does is bundle 9 Virginia-class boats and 5 Columbia-class boats into one long-term commitment, the kind of multi-year arrangement the Navy has used before under what's called a block buy contract. That's an arrangement that lets a shipyard buy materials in bulk across several ships at once, usually cheaper than negotiating one boat at a time. There's also a physical detail about how these submarines get built that explains why a contract spanning 2 shipyards makes sense in the first place. Virginia-class construction is split between General Dynamics Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, and Huntington Ingalls Industries' Newport News shipbuilding in Virginia. Each yard builds separate sections of the hull, and final assembly alternates between the 2 yards from boat to boat, a process the shipbuilders call hull swapping. It keeps both yards' workforces busy and their skills sharp on every hull, rather than having one yard specialize in modules it never sees finished. Columbia-class construction follows a similar 2-yard division of labor, which is part of why a single contract spanning both classes at both shipyards makes administrative sense, even though the submarines themselves serve completely different missions. Here's the plain language version of what each class of submarine actually is, because the 2 are built for very different jobs. The Virginia class is a fast attack submarine, designated SSN. Its job is hunting other submarines and surface ships, gathering intelligence, and launching cruise missiles when needed. The Navy calls it a blue water asset, meaning it's built to operate anywhere in the open ocean, not just near friendly coastlines. A single Virginia-class boat costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion and takes roughly 5 to 6 years to build from the time steel is cut to the time it's delivered to the fleet. The Columbia-class is a different animal entirely. It's a ballistic missile submarine, designated SSBN, and its only job is to stay hidden and carry part of the nation's nuclear deterrent. The United States maintains what's called a nuclear triad, the ability to deliver nuclear weapons by land-based missile, by bomber aircraft, and by submarine. The submarine leg is widely considered the most survivable of the 3, because a submarine at sea is extremely difficult to locate and destroy. Columbia-class boats are meant to replace the aging Ohio-class submarines, which have been in service since the early 1980s and are reaching the end of their certified hull life on a fixed schedule that doesn't bend for budget delays. The program was originally known internally as the Ohio Replacement Program before the Navy settled on the Columbia name, and the lead boat, USS District of Columbia, is expected to conduct its first deterrent patrol sometime in the early 2030s, time to take over as the oldest Ohio-class boats retire one by one. It's also worth explaining what a Virginia payload module is, because it's part of why the newest Virginia-class boats cost more than older ones in the same class. Recent Virginia-class blocks, referred to as Block V and later, insert an extra mid-body section into the hull that adds 4 large-diameter missile tubes, each capable of firing multiple Tomahawk cruise missiles. That upgrade roughly triples a single boat's missile strike capacity compared to earlier Virginia-class boats. And it exists partly to make up for strike capacity the Navy is losing as its 4 converted Ohio-class guided missile submarines, the SSGNs, reach the end of their service lives. Those are the same SSGN's officials reference when they talk about the 22-boat Virginia-class target eventually taking over that role. I spent time going through the Navy's public shipbuilding plans and budget justification documents, and one detail kept nagging at me. The Ohio-class retirement schedule is not flexible. Submarines have a certified reactor and hull life, and once that clock runs out, the boat has to be decommissioned regardless of whether its replacement is ready. That's the complication that recasts everything about this contract. This isn't a simple, the Navy wants a bigger fleet story. It's the Navy racing a retirement deadline it cannot postpone while trying not to let its attack submarine fleet shrink in the process. What strikes us about this case is how little room for error a fixed physical deadline leaves a bureaucracy that's used to slipping schedules. Most defense programs can absorb a year of delay by adjusting expectations. A reactor hull life can't be renegotiated in a budget hearing. That single constraint is doing more to shape this $76 billion contract than any strategic doctrine document. That race has not gone smoothly. According to Government Accountability Office reports on the submarine industrial base, Virginia-class deliveries have consistently run 1 to 3 years behind schedule over the past several years. The reasons cited include workforce shortages at both shipyards, a supplier base that shrank after the Cold War and hasn't fully recovered, and disruptions to the supply chain that started during the pandemic and never fully resolved. Building a nuclear submarine requires a highly specialized workforce: certified welders, nuclear-qualified technicians, and precision machinists. Both Electric Boat in Connecticut and Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia have reported difficulty hiring and retaining enough of them to hit their build targets. Here's an obstacle that doesn't get talked about enough. The Navy's stated goal has been to deliver roughly 2 Virginia-class submarines per year. For most of the last decade, the actual delivery rate has hovered closer to 1 boat a year, sometimes less. That gap between the target rate and the real rate is exactly why a $76.6 billion contract on its own doesn't guarantee the 22-boat fleet arrives on any particular timeline. Congress can appropriate the money. The Navy can sign the contract. But steel still has to bend, welds still have to pass inspection, and people still have to show up to do the work. The Navy and Congress haven't ignored that gap. In recent defense spending bills, lawmakers have directed billions of dollars specifically toward what's called submarine industrial base investment. Money aimed at expanding supplier capacity, funding apprenticeship and welding certification programs, and helping both shipyards recruit workers from surrounding communities. Electric Boat and Newport News Shipbuilding have each run public hiring campaigns and partnered with local trade schools and community colleges to build a pipeline of new nuclear-qualified workers. It's a real response to a real bottleneck. Whether it closes the gap between 1 boat a year and 2 boats a year fast enough to matter is still an open question, and it's one GAO auditors say they'll keep checking on with each new budget cycle. What's most surprising about this contract isn't the size of the number. Big defense contracts are common. What's surprising is the timing, because this commitment lands at the same moment the United States has separately agreed, under the AUKUS security partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom, to eventually sell several Virginia-class submarines to the Australian Navy starting in the early 2030s. That means the same 2 shipyards now building toward this new contract are also expected to produce extra hulls for a foreign partner, using the same limited pool of skilled labor and the same constrained supplier base described in those GAO reports. The AUKUS arrangement itself is worth explaining in plain terms because it's easy to misread. Under the pact announced between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, the U.S. Navy has committed to selling a small number of used Virginia-class submarines to Australia starting in the early 2030s as a bridge until Australia and the UK jointly build a new submarine design of their own. Australian officials have publicly acknowledged that those sales are explicitly conditioned on the U.S. Navy's own production rate improving first. The deal includes language allowing Washington to delay or adjust the transfers if American shipbuilding can't keep pace with the Navy's own fleet requirements. In other words, the same production shortfall driving this contract is also the built-in escape clause in a major alliance commitment. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. Locking in 22 Virginia-class boats on paper is the easy part. The hard part, the part that actually determines whether any of this happens on schedule, is whether the shipyards can hire and keep enough qualified workers, and whether Congress keeps funding the submarine industrial base investments needed to expand supplier capacity year after year without interruption from budget stopgaps. A $76 billion contract is a signal of intent. It is not, by itself, a guarantee of delivery. What do you think? Is committing this much money years in advance the right way to fix a shipbuilding backlog? Or does it just lock in spending without solving the underlying workforce and supply chain problems that caused the delays in the first place? There's a detail buried in how this money splits that tells you where the Navy's real priority sits. 5 Columbia-class boats, at a unit cost that runs well above even a Virginia-class attack submarine, still make up a smaller share of the total hull count in this contract than the 9 Virginia-class boats do. But Columbia-class construction is treated as the top funding priority within the submarine portfolio whenever the two programs compete for the same limited shipyard capacity. That's because of the fixed Ohio-class retirement clock we mentioned earlier. If Columbia slips, the nuclear deterrent mission has far less flexibility to absorb the delay than the attack submarine fleet does. In practice, that means when a shipyard has to choose which submarine gets a scarce specialized worker or a scarce component on a given week, Columbia-class work tends to win. That prioritization has a cost, and it's a real one for the attack submarine fleet. Every specialized worker and every constrained supplier assigned to Columbia-class construction is a worker and a supplier not available to speed up Virginia-class production. Naval analysts who track the submarine industrial base have pointed out that this is part of why the Virginia-class delivery rate has struggled to reach 2 boats a year, even with steady funding. The industrial base supporting both programs draws from the same finite pool of people and parts, and Columbia-class doesn't have room to wait. Put yourself in the position of a Navy budget planner for a moment. You have a nuclear deterrent submarine that must be ready on a fixed date because its predecessor is aging out of service on a schedule set by physics, not policy. You also have an attack submarine fleet that allies are counting on, and that a rival Navy's own submarine expansion makes more urgent every year. You have 2 shipyards, a limited number of nuclear-qualified welders, and a supplier base that took decades to shrink and won't rebuild itself in one budget cycle. A $76.6 billion contract doesn't solve that trade-off. It just puts a number on how much the country is willing to spend trying to manage it. So where does this actually stand today? According to Navy procurement announcements, the contract is signed and covers the 9 Virginia-class and 5 Columbia-class boats described above, formalizing shipbuilding work at General Dynamics Electric Boat and Huntington Ingalls Industries. What is confirmed is the contract value, the hull count, and the 2 shipyards involved. What remains unverified, at least in public reporting, is the exact delivery schedule for each individual hull, and whether the workforce and supplier investments needed to hit the Navy's 2-boat-per-year target for Virginia-class construction will materialize on the timeline the Navy is hoping for. Congressional testimony and GAO reporting in recent years have been consistently more cautious than Navy public statements on that particular question, and that gap between official optimism and independent oversight assessment is worth watching as this contract moves from signature to actual steel being cut. We cut a few of the specific dollar breakdowns per hull class from this script to keep things moving. Comment "more" if you want a deeper follow-up video on exactly how the Columbia-class unit cost compares boat by boat to the Virginia-class, because the numbers there tell their own story about where the money is really going. What isn't yet public is how the Navy plans to sequence Australia's future Virginia-class purchases under AUKUS against its own fleet needs without one program slowing the other down. That's a question defense committees in Congress have raised directly, and it doesn't have a public answer yet. If you want to track this yourself, the primary sources are the Navy's own procurement announcements, quarterly GAO reports on the submarine industrial base, and congressional testimony from Navy shipbuilding officials, all worth reading directly rather than taking any single outlet's summary at face value, including ours. For now, the 22-boat Virginia-class target is locked into a contract. Whether it's locked into a shipyard's actual production line, on schedule, is the part nobody can promise yet.